Recording in progress.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Corner tonight. My name is Andrea, and I'm going to pass it over to you.
And hello, my name is Bucky.
And we have a host today. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. My name is Belinda. People call me B.
Great. And tonight's topic will be recognizing biases and power imbalance in the medical field in regards to voicing. B, when you go into a doctor's office or you make a medical appointment, what do you hope to see from an interpreter?
Wow, that's a lot to think about in terms of what I'd like to see. But specifically, what I would like is appropriate representation of what I'm attempting to communicate, right? When I'm using ASL, as they're bringing that into English. So first and foremost, I have to say it's difficult. It's difficult for me to know exactly how an interpreter is representing me. It's not something that I'm privy to, despite the fact that I can monitor it. That's the obvious issue. But another thing that's complicating matters is mass. So when interpreters are using mass, I have no idea to the full extent of what it is that they're trying to communicate. And there are a lot of things that I'm missing in between. So mass are a tremendous hurdle. I believe that's something that all of us are experiencing. And in the event that the masks come down, still at times it's difficult to determine if the interpreter is representing the appropriate tone or if perhaps they are using, if their pace is appropriate, if it sounds fluid, or perhaps if they're using words, English words specifically, that are appropriate, that represent me and the educational level that I possess, if it represents my personality, if it reflects my mood. Those are all elements that are difficult for me to really determine. And to be quite frank, I don't like it. It's terrible to not really know what exactly is happening and how an interpreter is representing me and whether it's appropriate or not. I'm not sure if you get that.
Yeah. I definitely have had the exact same experience where you're wondering, is the interpreter for my medical appointments and wanting to make sure that they're representing me in English correctly, because this is my health on the line, right? That's a critical thing to communicate. So we really have to make sure that we're aware of the interpreters that we're working with. And I make sure that they match my needs in those settings when I'm getting those appointments set up. So I'm wondering, when you're able to go to the doctor's office and you want to make sure that you have the right interpreter, that it's not just an agency interpreter that's showing up that you have no idea who they are, what their name is, or potentially an agency has informed you of a name, but you don't recognize who that is. I think it's important for the deaf community to learn how to handle that situation. So what would you say to that?
So just taking a step back to answer the initial question, really, I have to admit that I don't always use interpreters. I have started to use interpreters over the course of the past 10 years. Historically, I have always written back and forth and communicated that way. And the reason for that is because, I'm in my 50s now. I'm in my late 50s. And I don't know how I can ask for an interpreter all the time. And, I've always experienced pushback, not from interpreters, but from the doctor's office. They indicate, well, we don't do that. And so I've always just passively accepted that. It wasn't until I got involved on social media, particularly Facebook, where I was like, wait a minute. I was exposed to information there and realized that I had rights. And so I'm a little late to the game, so to speak. But again, just to back up, let me clarify. I did know my husband always kind of said, hey, you need to request interpreters, and kind of got on my case about it. But it was a matter of being shy or a little timid and not wanting to deal with potential pushback or doctors looking at me or developing certain feelings about me. But I did recently find a doctor who themselves are a tremendous advocate for me and were in very strong support of having an interpreter for me. And so they were more than willing. And certainly I've used interpreters in the past, but my experience with interpreters in general has not been positive. Growing up in the 70s and the 80s, my experience in early college, did not go to Gallaudet myself, but in early college was not positive as far as interpreters are concerned. To see interpreters not understand my sign language or not understand the vocabulary, it inhibits trust. And so thinking back to the office that handles coordinating of services, I didn't really know how to do it then. And so I didn't realize that I could request specific interpreters. And so I just got used to what I got. I just accepted what was handed to me. And at times the work was effective, and at other times it was not. But I had never quite developed the intention of requesting specific interpreters. Certainly, I had interpreters that I did like. I certainly had them in mind, but I did not request.
Oh, yes. That is a great answer. And thinking or in regards to your rights and realizing that you had the right to request an interpreter, and also in response to your comment about engaging with an interpreter, if you're an audience member here, if you're thinking about how grew up and your experience with interpreters and whether you went to a deaf residential school and that dynamic as well, there is a great range of experience there. So you have to think about if that person has a deaf heart or not. And especially with the setting, you have to think about, okay, am I going to be able to chat with this interpreter to know if they're a match for me skill wise or not? Are they going to be able to understand the medical terminology and things like that? And that is what we get when we talk to the interpreter beforehand, to know if the interpreter is a match for myself and what I need.
But Andrea, I wonder, when the interpreter doesn't engage with you to do that check beforehand, what do you do when you end up in the office after that? What do you do with that?
Yeah, that's another thing. That's another complicated layer to add to the dynamic as well. If I try to engage socially with the interpreter to see if they're a match for me, to see if they're comfortable with interpreting for me, if they understand my signing and things like that. And again, we know with COVID, interpreters using a mask, it's hard to understand or determine if the interpreter is matching my cadence, my tone, and so forth. So honestly, I would say most interpreters we're not sure if they even have the medical certificate or if they have the certification to know that they have that particular skill set for the medical field. So there's not exactly a way that we can know if they match that, if they have that background and experience. So I find that socializing or having that pre-check conversation with the interpreter is imperative. And I have to think of how do they make sure that they are voicing and matching the way that I interact with the medical professionals there. So to not put the onus on me to do the extra work, I want to know what the interpreter does to make sure that they engage with the work, to make sure that, I guess, not their personality, but they do the work to check that they have the skill set to be there. And I think most interpreters don't do that check.
Well, I have a few thoughts. The way that I handle interpreters now is quite different than how I used to handle interpreters. So when I started using interpreters, I've noticed that deaf individuals by and far sometimes have various secondary people that come with them. But, 10 to 15 years ago, I used to look up to interpreters. I really did.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, as you're, not that I have had relationships with all interpreters, but there are some interpreters who are sort of segregated. They keep themselves apart from the deaf community. They're not really integrated. There's a line there, and they don't really come together in the middle with the community. Some interpreters appear cliquish, and that's a story within itself, but I can't quite ascertain or describe specifically, but that typical behavior indicates a power imbalance. And again,
Yes. Yes.
It's not how I feel about all interpreters. Some interpreters do an excellent job about making sure that the power seems to be equal. But, for example, some interpreters, and I'm sorry to say this, but it's a turnoff, and there are issues there that, again, that I can't specifically explain. And I don't expect interpreters to be able to read my mind, so to speak. Obviously, they're not going to be able to read my thoughts. That's not an expectation that I have. And I also don't expect perfection. Over the many years that I did not have interpreters and I was doing my best to communicate, obviously I have that lens, but looking at how I handle matters now, I tend to consider two things. Well, in fact, three things. So, I have apps on my phone that are truly life-changing.
Oh, that's a good one.
But, for example, if I'm sick and I'm not feeling well, I can be forgetful. I mean, forget. And, it's difficult for me to have to look at the individual who is speaking and looking at my phone. These live transcriptions apps, they're beneficial, but again, they're coming through the form of text. Obviously, I will bring my husband with me. And my husband is simply observing. He is watching the interpreter. And that is very helpful. He doesn't get involved directly, but he does observe the interaction just to ensure that
to
I'm
be an advocate. Yeah.
Yeah, just that I'm being appropriately represented. And then the other thing that I don't do at all of my doctor's appointments, but I will if I've had a previous problem with a specific interpreter and I'm feeling like the doctor is looking down upon me as if I'm, dumb or I'm incompetent or I'm not understanding the situation.
Yeah.
Is I will have a prepared list. I will type it out. It indicates in that list that I'm deaf, that the interpreter representing me may not be accurate. And it is incumbent upon you as the doctor to check in with me to ensure that I understand, to indicate a direct relationship and not rely upon the interpreter. So I clarify with that medical professional that they are responsible for ensuring that I do understand and not just accepting this interpreting process, and assuming that the interpreter was correct. And so it's a team effort, right? It's the interpreter, it's myself, it's the medical professional. We have to work together to ensure that the situation was effective. And that has been very helpful.
That's nice.
And it's about putting the responsibility on that doctor, right? And
Exactly.
and I've heard of stories, right, where doctors are enraged or they're upset at their patients because their patients are not following medical advice. But it is not the patient's fault. It should not be about blaming the patient. They should be looking at the communication channel, looking at the interpreter. But these doctors are blaming these patients and really the doctors are responsible, right? They should be following up with patients and checking in with patients.
I love
and
that.
Not just accepting with what the interpreters are doing.
I like that you have two techniques. You mentioned using a live transcription app on your phone to double check how communication is going, and then also following up with a doctor and making sure that they have a forewarning ahead of time via email.
Oh, actually, it's a physical paper that I print out and bring to them so that they can look at it while we are physically there in the office. It's a conversational point there. And so again, that paper, it's self-advocacy because it's not always about trusting the interpreter. It's about, putting oneself at risk. So just to share specifically one particular situation, this was quite some time ago, a few years back. I went to a doctor's office. This doctor was new. This whole situation was new to me. And it was a problem with my stomach. And I was visiting this new caretaker. And so, this isn't about misogyny. It's not, I'm not sure if I'm communicating that correctly, but it felt like female to female or woman to woman violence. I felt like she was really looking down upon me as if I were dumb. I saw the interpreter laughing and seemingly siding with the doctor. I felt like it was 2 against 1. And, at that very moment, I reached out to the interpreting agency and I indicated to them never to send that interpreter back to me. This was my initial experience. And I decided that interpreter was going to be on my blacklist. I don't know if that's the correct term, but essentially the do not call list. I do not want that interpreter providing services for me. And I had only have all these years that have gone by, I've only had 2 people on that list. I am flexible. We have to be flexible. For those of us who have experienced this life as a deaf person, we don't have these choices all the time.
Lucky.
I wanted to go back and talk about that live transcription app. I really love that idea, but I do wonder, if I were to do that and bring my phone in and be ready and start that, I would feel a little bit, I wonder if that's going to offset the interpreter, if they're going to be offended and be like, what do you mean you don't trust me? You don't trust my work? And I'm saying, well, I want to make sure that the work is correct. And me as the deaf consumer feel like I'm at risk. And I don't know if that's creating additional risk by going in and setting that up and expecting them to just take that. But otherwise it's just trusting them without any evidence. So what do you do?
I think that's a clear example of an abuse of power.
So the problem here is if an interpreter is feeling offended at the fact that we have to double check, that's the problem. That's the real concern, right? We have to double check this. This is our communication. We need to ensure that we're being represented clearly. And okay, so just thinking about myself personally. Over the years, interpreters have gotten so used to not being checked, not being double checked.
Yes.
Right? Everything is just taken.
Yeah.
They're used to
They're
having
lazy
that
about it. Yeah.
control and having that stranglehold on the communication process. And so again, I know many deaf will say, no, like for example, criticizing an interpreter's sign or the way that they may use sign and or indicating to an interpreter that they need to change their signing. That's not what I'm talking about. We all have sign preferences and sign variations. That's not the point here. What I'm really concerned about, like I'm trying to, I just want to make sure that I want the right words to communicate this, because it's not about sign preference, right? It's about communication style. It's about being empowered.
How the interpreters articulate your signed communication.
Yeah.
Right. It is that. I have a hard time watching interpreters. So just to give you one small example. This particular interpreter is somebody who I would describe as a preferred interpreter. It does not mean that this particular interpreter is the best. It's not how I would describe this interpreter, but this interpreter is familiar with me and I am used to their style. Again, they're not the best of the best. They're not the top of the line, but again, I'm used to this interpreter. I have used this interpreter over the course of many years. But one particular time, and it could have been that this interpreter was tired. Maybe this person didn't get enough sleep. Maybe this person needed more coffee that day. I don't know. Maybe it was me. Maybe I was tired. Maybe my signing wasn't clear. I wasn't feeling well. Who knows? But so I was communicating with the doctor, and I do tend to look at the doctor. I tend to look at the doctor when I'm communicating. I don't tend to look away and at the interpreter very often. But at this particular time, I did happen to look away and watch the interpreter. And I saw a pause and and I saw this movement on the hand, and you could see that the vocal intonation was very slow, and it appeared to be something as of well, and so just watching it was like watching a video or a person signing and they're like miming, or the video is staggered. Like that's what I saw. It was a very staggered representation of the communication that represents me. And so that was shocking. And I thought, oh my gosh, I need to be aware of how I'm being represented. All this time had passed, but I was just passively accepting the representation from the interpreter. But that moment really made me realize that, and I really am the type of person that just goes with the flow. I just kind of, I just accept things. But that was a really strong wake up moment for me.
Yeah. And I know that every deaf person has had this experience of having a bad interpreter or a bad voice interpreter, where the interpreter doesn't know enough of that background or have that skill set, and it may be based on their location. But as a deaf person themselves, we have to think about how can we take that power back to make it more equal. I think that this needs more discussion and more authenticity. Usually like, oh yeah, we're all cool, everything's good. But like when this thing happened, there's a power imbalance. How do we unpack that situation? How should we handle it? So to make sure that we empower ourselves. And deaf people can die from having miscommunications. They have allergies and things like that. We have to be advocates for ourselves. And when we're going into a doctor's office, and if we're feeling like, oh, the interpreter does not have to advocate for us in any sense, then that's problematic. You know, we have to think of, okay, when we're pulling a doctor in to this conversation, there's a medical professional and there's a power dynamic there. So it takes both ourselves and the interpreter and the doctor as a team to facilitate this conversation to make sure that we're on the same pace and one accord, right? So I really want to dive into that because I feel like it's so hard to do because like you said, there's accents, you know, there's things that happens over and over. And sometimes you get tired of interpreters who are unskilled with their voicing abilities. And so that power imbalance is already there. So how do we take that back? I feel like it's such an interesting conversation.
Well, there's a lot to think about here, but interpreters themselves, you know, the field itself is young, right? It's a developing
Definitely.
profession.
A
There's a
lot of
lot of
new.
changes that have taken place over the years. You know, codas, interpreters that, you know, were raised and reared in the deaf community interpreting for their parents. And there were many interpreters that what we would call homegrown. They were sort of developed and trained by the community. And so it was sort of parental, so to speak, right? The community monitored what was happening in the scope of interpreting. But as we are moving away from that sort of deaf community sort of taking care of the interpreting and who does interpret and what happens, and now we're shifting into a different direction, right? So if we look at this as a paradigm where deaf community takes care of what happens within it all the way to the other side where everybody's, it's sort of no man's land and everybody's on their own and there's not a lot of monitoring taking place. You know, we do have interpreters who really abdicate responsibility, right? They support themselves. And certainly some interpreters, you know, just one small example to illustrate my point here. So this interpreter who may leave the room when the doctor leaves the room, right? So you have an interpreter who leaves the room the
Yes.
moment that the doctor leaves the room. Instead of taking advantage of that opportunity to become familiar with the particular deaf consumer, their signing style, right? So, and I know that people don't want to get involved in terms of sharing information about their personal lives, their family, or where they went to school, but just having small talk, right? Small talk goes a long way. It's not just for them, it's for me as the consumer too. It helps
Yes.
me perceive their signing style. This is a two-way street, right? And so the doctor leaves the office, and then that interpreter leaves, and they have robbed me of the opportunity to really become someone who partakes in that communication process. And then the second thing is hey, you know, this idea that interpreters are professionals and they're right there with the doctors and they have these barriers. And I'm sorry, but I call bullshit.
Yes.
Okay. Because first of all, they are not doctors. They
Yeah.
are interpreters. And their job is focused on communication. And so I'm just trying to think of an example here. I'm having a difficult time just thinking of an example on the fly. But if you're looking at communication and where to get, you know, the feel for communication, how can you really assess communication when you walk out of that room, right? How arrogant is that? You leave that room, you're not even spending time trying to figure out where my communication needs are. You're walking out of the room, right? And so interpreters who are interpreting and involved in various interpreting situations are not, and this isn't just me, it's also my daughter who has multiple disabilities, right? And so she sees many specialists for various body parts, for her mouth, etc. And so as far as I'm concerned, you know, cues, for example, I offer them tremendous amounts of information, what things mean. I have taken my time to educate interpreters. And, this is my situation. This is my situation with my daughter. And if you walk out of that room, really. And so many interpreters and interpreting groups, right, on Facebook or social media, people indicate, well, I'm a professional, just like the doctor. And I'm here to say you are not. You are not a doctor, right? You do not have the medical experience and journey of 10 to 12 years of education. The demands are not the same. I don't think that's an appropriate comparison.
Yes, there is a separation there. Exactly. And that brings me to your point about the interpreters leaving the room with the doctor instead of using that time to get clarification with you. I think that there's an opportunity that is missed there, just to say like, hey, deaf consumer, was there something that you didn't understand? Is my
Yes.
interpreting clear? Let me provide you with some more clarification about what the doctor meant there, or this word here, I didn't understand what it meant. Let me give you the finger
Oh,
spelled option. But if you just say, oh, okay, you got this, and I'm leaving the room, that opportunity is gone.
okay. So one very positive experience. This was actually fairly recent. I actually went to the for an endoscopy check. They did insert, and I did get put under, and they did that check. And while I was laying down, I saw the interpreter. I think the nurse had left the room, and the interpreter didn't. The interpreter was sitting there, not doing anything in particular. But the interpreter started explaining to me that the doctor's tone was very friendly and that the nurse was in the hallway and they were having friendly banter. And it just indicating that this doctor was really laid back, and it just was a really positive environment. And I thought, wow, individuals who can hear would have access to that. They would know that. It would be soothing to them. If they were nervous, it might calm them. It might reduce the
Exactly.
anxiety, right?
Just
Because
from
they
the
can hear
environmental
it.
noise. Yes.
Yes. And thanks to that interpreter who was informing me about all of this environmental noise and the friendly banter in the hallway, that really calmed me.
That's
Yes.
excellent.
She didn't just sit there and think, well, my job is done once that medical professional leaves the room. No, this interpreter gave me access to what was happening in the environment. It was phenomenal.
Yeah, and that's great. Just to talk about what you like to see as far as the interpreter providing background information and to know that the banter was happening. I think that that's a voicing tip that all deaf people or most deaf people would like to see, interpreters who voice. And if they're still voicing, to finish up a concept, to sign at the same time to show like, hey, I'm still finishing up my process. And then that makes sure that we are aligned and I can offer that feedback to the interpreter. And that's also feedback to me. And then I'll realize like, oh, okay, the interpreter needs more time to process. And I'll know that they are communicating with me and that they're wrapping up their concept, and that's a two-way street. Yeah,
So to clarify, you're talking about SIMCOM,
I,
simultaneous communication?
I just meant, I realized while voicing, even if it was some extended concept that they needed to provide some background information or cultural mediation for, I think that's a skill set in itself to just sign to show where you are during your process.
Okay, so I think Bucky had asked the secondary part of the question about how to improve this process. And something specifically
Yes.
for me that I would like to see is that interpreters bring their own captioning, right? Like their own service, right? And I'm not talking about having the little app on the phone that's really small, where I have to look at that and compete with watching the interpreter.
Like iPad size.
Yeah,
Like
something
that, yes.
big, right? And it's on like a tripod stand or something where I just have the ability, you know, It's not where that way I can have complete faith in the process, right? About the service that they're providing. And it's not to offend them. It's a team effort again. And, to add to that, doctors can also look at this. And this has happened before, right? Where I have the transcription app on my phone and I'm like, wait a minute, no, I didn't say that. Or the doctor could go back and correct themselves because they can see the transcription, or the nurse can correct themselves because they have a physical, tangible representation of what it is that looks like it's being communicated, right? So there's an advantage there. And so with this idea of having this tablet, with interpreters, that would really benefit that. That's one thing. And then the other thing is the problem with interpreters in medical settings or at a doctor's office is that there are never second interpreters, right? There's no one cross-checking that work. But I also understand, right, that many interpreters they're not quite open to feedback, right? They don't accept that feedback. If an interpreter offers them a correction or something, they may be upset. They may respond negatively. But really, having that double check is great for the team's effort there. And another small example related to this, an interpreter was using a classifier. And really that classifier was not appropriate for the situation, and it caused me to misunderstand. And my husband, being there, asked for clarification. Are you trying to sign this? Are you trying to communicate that? And, my husband was able to support that positive correction. And again, it's because there was a second person there. But this privilege, right? That was a privilege for me to have my husband there. Suppose my husband passes away. Suppose I don't have that member of my family that can do that, right? There are many deaf people out there who do not have family members who sign.
You're right.
Yes.
And so that's a privilege that I have, that my partner and that my husband is fluent in American Sign Language and is willing to come with me to monitor the communication exchange. And so, having a second person, but because interpreters are very expensive, no one would accept that. No one would.
Indeed, that's so true.
So that's a dream to never come.
And thinking of the interpreters' voicing skills, what do you think about certified deaf interpreters in the medical field? I've noticed that there's more, I don't mean to say that it's hard, but do you feel like it's a more smoother experience to have a CDI for people who don't have the reading and writing skills and the ability to advocate for themselves?
Oh, okay. So I really wish that hearing interpreters were not feeling threatened by this idea. Really, really wish that were not the case, that they were not feeling threatened by CDIs, that hearing interpreters understand that they have a role and that certified deaf interpreters or deaf interpreters have their respective role.
Two separate things indeed.
And I know that I have addressed this on my page. I've shared this particular situation that happened. I was having an issue with my eye. And the interpreter, right, so this was live services, and essentially they were not that within my actual eye, right? And so I was communicating with them and I was pointing to this specific area, not on this side of the eye, the cornea is over here, but behind the eye. And so the live transcription service was talking about inside the eye, and I was talking behind the eye, right? And so that's my problem is I don't like to say English per se, but like I have to actually sign in the back of the eye, as opposed to using a classifier and indicating with space what I'm referring to. So I literally had to sign to them physically in the back, right? And, you know, I understand that this particular person was learning, but there was another situation where I was becoming angry, and I am not by nature an angry person. I was very frustrated. This interpreter kept signing this with the C hand shape, and I didn't understand what they were trying to communicate. And so when my husband got in and was explaining, right, so there's essentially a curtain, right? A curtain that covers the eye, right? Right. And it's a problem, right? So it's a curtain, right? It causes a black spot. It covers, and they were signing like a physical curtain, like drapes in a house. And for the life of me, I could not figure out why they were talking about a window curtain and what that had to do with my eye.
Yeah.
Okay. So and so my husband is not a CDI, but he sort of functioned, right, like a
as
CDI.
an advocate. Sure.
Yeah, so he got involved. He interrupted the interpreter. He handled that communication exchange. He understands my style. So again, this is why I'm trying to emphasize having a second or a third person, you know, even if it is a friend, if it's another deaf person, it's so imperative.
Yeah, I do have a comment, but we want to let you all know that if you guys have any questions in the audience, please raise your hand. We'll have a question to answer later, and we'll bring you guys up to ask those on video. But while we're waiting on some of that, I wanted to ask about your recommendation, V, that interpreters bring a physical device with live transcribe on it, so that, or interpreters to say, I have to have a CDI to come with me. I think that is the kind of interpreter who tells me that they actually want to make sure that communication is facilitated effectively and successfully. Because I'm human. You know, I may be the best interpreter, but if we're still learning, we want to make sure that we get all of the correct information there and not be offended by correction and by navigating the space to make sure that the information is correct. And if we get to the end and we have a correct transcript, that's what it's about. It's about you as the patient and the doctor getting the correct information. It is not about me as the interpreter in the room. If interpreters were willing to bring that kind of attitude to reinforce their work, I think that that's a very good idea. Or to advocate for a CDI. Absolutely.
Yes. And now with VRI, video remote interpreting, being more popular now, that brings me to this comment to think about this shift to VRI interpreters. Do we feel like there should be a push for more CDI interpreters in the VRI space? When you're using the video remote tool or interpreter for a medical appointment, I think of this shift with using a hearing interpreter and using a CDI to make sure that the feedback is there to the hearing interpreter, that they have facilitated communication clearly, that they have a CDI that they can use as well, to use both as a resource. Because again, not all deaf people are fluent in American Sign Language or their receptive abilities either.
So just one thing to add to that in terms of interpreters, you know, many interpreters go through their interpreter training programs, right? They're 18 months long. They're 2 years long. And looking at packing all of that information, knowledge, and experience into 2 years or 18 months, you know, you have to really ask the question, how can you expect interpreters? You know, I think IPPs or ITPs, these programs, right? There needs to be change. There needs to be deaf leadership, right? In times past, you know, having good interpreters, well, or, you know, maybe not specifically good interpreters, but deaf taught interpreters, community raised, right? Homegrown, and we're moving away from that. And so now we are having interpreters who are being
Yep.
raised and reared by the hearing
Yes.
community.
Yeah. And with doctors, especially, they have a 5-year long residency, right? They get that training. So I think that interpreters or new grads should be mentored as well, especially in a situation where people's lives are at risk or on the line, just to make sure that they have that opportunity for training and mentorship. And I think this should be mandatory for interpreters, that they should push and advocate for use of CDIs, just to, what do you think, right?
Yeah, I actually like that idea. So, right, what does a residency include? What does it mean, right? You've graduated, right? You've achieved some kind of, certificate, right? You're not yet credentialed, right? I forget what the term is, but you're not credentialed. It's like, what is the term? Oh, right. So
The
the
EIPA.
EIPA, right? So like they have levels, right? They have these tests, but still they should be doing some kind of a residency, right? They should be maybe a 2-year residency where they have a secondary individual involved, whether it is for VRS, whether it's for medical, whether it's for educational. Not looking at court work. I'm hoping that new interpreters are not going into the legal system, but
Yeah.
anyways, just looking at having a minimum of a 2-year residency, I think, who's going to pay for that, right? Who's going to fund that?
Right.
Right.
I do have a question on that. So when we talk about, so we have an interpreter for your appointment, right? And they show up. Or you show up, but the interpreter hasn't yet. When that doctor's office also has VRI ready, they have the system, they have it all ready to go. Would you at that point say, let's just get it done and let's use the VRI interpreter until a physical on-site interpreter can arrive? Or would you say, stop, hold everything until I have a physical interpreter in the room?
Mm.
I'll be honest with you, I would prefer to wait for that physical interpreter. My experience with VRI, I think, just a couple of times, just a handful of times, I have not been impressed with the VRI. The individuals that I'm seeing on VRI, they may not have enough experience or background knowledge, but again, with just a handful of times that I've experienced VRI, I've been singularly unimpressed.
Yeah, I can imagine that VRI could be a really great concept when you're working with the receptionist and, giving your name to check in, getting an insurance card, and all of those little questions that you have to deal with.
Right.
That's a place that VRI could be safe.
Yeah, and I feel like there's some situations where the VRI would be effective until the interpreter arrived on site, right? So if you're in a doctor's office and you say that you'll use the VRI one time, then they may try to, force that habit to use the VRI instead of the on-site interpreter.
And the problem for me, not for everybody, right, is because for me, it's a technology-based issue, right? You basically have internet or network issues. The camera is off center. They're not uniformly placed in the center of the camera. And my time is valuable, right? And so the longer we're dealing with this, the longer we're squandering my time while they're trying to figure this out, I have limited energy, right? I've got my health on the line. And I know that that's not the same for all deaf, but when a deaf person goes to the doctor's office, they are not at their best, right? We are not at 100%. We don't have all of our energy. That's why we go to the doctor. Typically, we're at the doctor because we have reduced energy, reduced emotional capacity. We don't feel good. And so now we show up and we have to deal with this. this incompetence, other people's incompetence.
Mm.
Yeah, it's rough. It's rough for a lot of us.
Yeah.
And to have to navigate this and manage through these communication issues, to monitor incoming errors. There are so many things that are happening.
Work. Yes.
Yeah, simultaneously. Oh, gosh.
So one other thing that bothers me when we talk about interpreting the medical field, but it happens in other settings as well. But when me as a patient am taking the time to set everything up with my schedule and set an appointment with a date and time and expecting the office to work that out with an interpreter to show up. And we get to that day. Sometimes we have interpreter agencies that don't communicate with us on who the interpreter is, that we have somebody confirmed. We are trusting that to the doctor's office, right? And it's, as a deaf person, it's always like that internal fear of, am I going to have an interpreter? Who is it? When are they going to show up? And so I'm telling my boss, I need to be off for 2 hours because I have an appointment. I may have to work out childcare for my kids. There's a lot of time and energy that I expend into going to a doctor's office. And then, oh, we didn't get an interpreter. And sometimes the receptionist, oh, we forgot to ask, or the agency didn't confirm with us, or they said that nobody's available. And there was no communication with me as the person who was actually the patient. And hearing people are still showing up to that doctor's office all around me, getting to be seen. But there's no focus on me as the deaf patient and the time and energy that I spent in to this interaction. And that's always been frustrating for me.
And also, many doctors, right? Doctors in general are in high demand. Surgeons are in high demand, right? For a myriad of services, right? They're 6 months out. They have a wait list in order to be seen. My doctor's appointments, let's see, like I make them, let's see, I'm having appointments coming up and they're in January and I made them in August. And so if my interpreter doesn't show up, I would be livid. And so that's one thing. And that is a privilege that hearing people have, right? So as deaf individuals, we have so many other elements that have to align for us to be able to be seen. And so that I agree, with doctors and medical professionals having a 6-month wait list. Wow. Yeah. And to reschedule. And, these doctors say, oh, we're full. And so I won't be able to see you again for another 6 months.
And that is why we have a high percentage of deaf people who have serious health problems, because they're not able to get the right medical care that they deserve.
And in addition to that, I was having conversations with various deaf individuals, right? If you're on Medi-Cal, I don't know if this is a standard sign, but here in California,
Medicaid.
So many doctors do not accept it. And so patients who have it have to look, and they are on that waiting list, right? They're trying to find a practitioner who will accept that coverage, right? And so on top of that, then they have to fight for the provision of interpreting services. And so many interpreters don't show up. Yeah, it's just the whole system is exhausting. And, some deaf, as a result of that, won't use interpreters, right? So, they're fed up. Right. They've had enough. And so they just prefer pen and paper, Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I would say interpreters in general are aware of when they show up to that appointment, they don't know the deaf person. They're used to freelance work in a ton of different scenarios with a ton of different deaf people. So that is a position of power, to see that my interaction will affect you in some way, and it could cause trauma, where there are miscommunications, and the deaf person have to accept that, or they have to monitor the interpreter so closely, which requires a lot more work. So there are power dynamics again in play, and it's a lot of work that is involved just to get there, right? So the interpreter, um, providing access is just one part. That's one example. Like you mentioned, the interpreter is leaving the room. That deaf person had to encounter a bunch of different barriers in order to get there successfully at the doctor's appointment. So the interpreter itself should be a good ally and try to improve the overall experience of the deaf patient. So this is just ongoing work that will be required, really.
Yeah, I remember a particular situation with an interpreter. We were sitting in the room and just, who do you know, right? Because that's how we sort of navigate the deaf community. Who knows who? That's just something that we do in the deaf community. And so the interpreter said, oh, I don't really hang out with people in the deaf community. I tend to stay out of all of that.
Yep.
Yeah, I see that a
Oh
lot.
my gosh. And that within itself is bias, right? It is.
Yes, it is.
This particular individual, feels like deaf people or the deaf community is over dramatic. There's too much going on, but deaf people are not dramatic, right? They have their everyday lives. If situation would happen to this particular interpreter, right? Just comparing, how would they feel? Let's say they were upset and, just if we were to say to her, the people like you kind of always have drama going on. How would she feel? Right? Just to look down on the deaf community or deaf people like that, to say, oh, I'm not hanging out in the deaf community. Deaf people are just too much trouble. And I don't want to bother with that. Ugh.
We do have one person with their hand raised. So I believe it's Mia, if you'll go ahead and come on.
Are we going to see this person? Okay. Got it.
Hello.
Yep, you're good.
This is Mia. Nice to meet you all. I have enjoyed watching. I just had a quick comment before I left. I've really enjoyed this conversation. This has been eye-opening regarding the interpreter and their service as an advocate within the interpreting community. And I am an advocate here at a hospital locally. And I have a mother, and I'm a mother of a special needs child. And I have experienced an issue with an interpreter. And there was a situation that happened yesterday with the patient. And there's a few things that happened. And I tried to give feedback to the interpreter as an advocate. And oftentimes, deaf patients, we forget that we have to reframe the way that the doctor sees me or communicates with me.
I'm in charge.
It's not as of I am, the deaf person, please pity me or look down on me. I am in charge of this doctor's appointment. I am empowered. I have control of this from beginning up to end. So I really enjoy everyone's comment. So I introduce myself to the interpreter. I give them my name and, give them a general idea of why I'm here and who I am and the things that I would like the interpreter to voice for me. Or just general things that I feel like they should know. And the interpreter automatically knows that they are not in charge. And I feel like that is key. that they should not look down on the deaf person, but they would recognize that their place is to facilitate communication, right? So the doctor should maintain eye contact with me. And if I have to look away to watch the interpreter, I am missing a lot of information. Sometimes I catch a lot of mistakes, which is frustrating. But I have to clarify and say, oh, no, I didn't mean that. This is what I actually meant, and do that extra work. But, sometimes when people go into the doctor's office, they have to write back and forth. And for example, if they had questions, they would have to have that already written down to show, like, oh, in case in that moment I forget, these are the things that I want to talk about. And then I would have to do that ping pong back and forth with watching the interpreter and the doctor. So I just want to make sure there's a way that we could write down the things that we needed or the questions that we had before the appointment was finished to make sure all of them were addressed during that appointment. And if we can get like a summary of what was discussed with the doctor and nurse before the appointment was finished, just to make sure that everything was resolved. I feel like if we were stressed or sick during that time, or maybe we weren't paying attention because we didn't feel well and didn't have the energy to catch all of that, to do the work we normally would do if we were healthy. So that's why I asked for a printed paper to go over with all the information that we talked about, to summarize what we talked about with the nurse or the doctor. And a lot of people would say like, oh, okay, you want me to stay so I can summarize what the interpreter said? That was eye-opening to a lot of people when I recommend to do that. Because a lot of doctors, are interacting with many people. And I feel like oftentimes I like for them to reconfirm what they understood at the end of the appointment, just for clarity reasons. And I feel like that I've been really enjoying watching this panel and this discussion tonight, because I feel like we suffer with, a lot of the times having to do this extra work of making sure that we reclaim the space in the power dynamics at play, right? So with a deaf client, most of the time they would sit back and say, okay, well, I'm just here and I'll passively accept what's happening. Where I'm like, no, as an advocate, you are in charge, you are in control of the situation, and your safety is first in priority. So you should definitely manage that space, and in a healthy way, of course. But if you're sick, those factors come into play, right? But oftentimes, um, I just feel like this is really important work and a really great conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
If I could just expand on something that you shared. So, if we want to bring a list ahead of time, if maybe I don't feel confident with my English, how then would you get that done? Is there a service? Would you get an interpreter to help you create this list ahead of time? What happens if you don't have that skill?
I say most of us should know ahead of time when we're going to the doctor's office, like the reasons they're going for. And if not, they can, write back and forth with an interpreter just to provide that clarity.
Perhaps a CDI could
That's not
support
always
like
available. Yeah, especially in a high metropolitan area. Sometimes there is access to CDIs, fortunately, but with the interpreting agency, they send out forms for the deaf person to fill out the pertinent information prior to the assignment. But you just want to make sure that the deaf community or the deaf person and the interpreter has that understanding. And a doctor's office is different because when you're going into the hospital or emergency room, you're sick, you're not well, there's medication that comes into play, you can feel disoriented. And if you have an interpreter there, you assume that, you know, they will take care of you to a certain extent, right? Like they will help me. You see that I'm disoriented, you see that I'm sick, and that's not always the case that I get that help, because some people are just like, well, that's not my problem. I'm just here to facilitate communication and leave. And right, just like you guys said, with the interpreters leaving the room, that's another thing that comes into play as well. So they don't always stay with you. So again, it's important to have these discussions often within the deaf community, just to make sure we are all on a general consensus about what the norms and standards are within interacting with the interpreters in the medical community. So before you go to that doctor's office, an appointment, if you have that list handy, if you're going to call the doctor's office, you want to book that appointment a week before, just to make sure that, hey, did you guys confirm with the interpreting agency that there will be an interpreter available? Things like that, that we have to do all the work and all the onus is on us. Yeah, so I agree with that commentary about, you know, as a community, we need to make sure that we have these systematic things in place. Because when we're at the doctor's office, we can't just assume that they will know or write down things to remember to call to check and see if the interpreter's there. You know, we can't always just rely on those assumptions. And like you said, with the 6-month waiting list, I have a child who cannot afford to wait. You know, so at those times, I need to be really aggressive or assertive to make sure that the doctor's appointment is booked. So not everyone is as assertive as I am either. So I wish that I could see that happening more times, to have that translation available. You know, that just happened to me yesterday and again today, that I thought like, wow, this would have been useful information to have. But this is something that happens pretty often. But we need to reclaim our identity and the power, even within the interpreting world. They're not there to help us per se. They're not there to think for me per se, but you know, to do some advocacy as well. This is my life at risk, and the interpreter is there to facilitate communication. They're a tool that I use for the doctor's appointment, just to make sure that, you know, when I have to make sure they know what they're doing and they have the skill sets and so forth. That's right. If I have a list of interpreters that I like to use within the agency and things like that. I'm sorry, I'm going on and on. I feel like I'm taking up a lot of time, but you know, this is a very important conversation. I appreciate you guys having it, and I think that we should do it more often.
Thank you very much. And I really do appreciate your comments.
Thank you. Bye.
So right now we are already 8 minutes past our time. So I want to thank everybody very much for your time. B, I really appreciate your thoughts, your stories, and your experiences and sharing these. It's very obvious that it's making an impact already with me, and I'm sure other people who are watching as well. So I really want to thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, we had fun today. Have a good night, everyone. See you. Bye.
Bye.